Okay, perfect. So today we'll be discussing an in-depth discussion of Vol's exclusion and embrace and its implications in counseling. First, we are going to discuss our thoughts on this book just as a whole, our overall opinion and what we liked and disliked, and if anything from the book is going to impact our overall lives or our future careers. So I'll start us off. I will be absolutely completely honest. It took me a while to understand this book. I had to reread the chapters multiple times just because of the academic tone and the way that Wolf expresses his ideas. However, at the end, once I felt that I had somewhat fully grasped the concepts, I started to reevaluate multiple aspects within my life. I feel like that's one of the things that I did like the most about the book. It made me question how I view justice, truth, oppression, violence, peace, etc. And I will say that what I really did like about Volf's writing was that he offered multiple perspectives for every argument he presented. He did not try to push his opinion on the reader. And I also feel like something that's going to be very important from this book in my career in counseling is it's important to not only understand worldviews, but to want to actively put in the effort to put yourself into the other person's shoes in order to achieve peace, understanding, and truth.
Is it my turn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, this book is very well versed in theology, sociology, and psychology. It brings so much in-depth exploration and examination of one of the most controversial and the most debated themes under the big umbrella concept of exclusion and embrace. So the volume of the analysis and argument built upon the extensive references are such a great resource for the professionals in those fields, in my opinion. But also it becomes a big challenge of the scholarly resource for me in my training as a counselor. What I really liked Wolf's is his sharp analysis and a seemingly analogous concept, but they're just the two sides of the coin. An example like distance, belongings, and departure without leaving, and so on. The arguments made on both sides actually helped me more fully understand the paradoxy truths and just really helped me grow. Wolf's vast and dense knowledge on these issues sometimes went way beyond my comprehension. And so I really didn't like having to stop so many times and slow down so much, as you all noticed. Therefore, I didn't like that, but it is a good challenge. At the end, I really felt like I got it, and it's like the light shining into a dark room.
Okay. Wolf says embrace is the dynamic relationship between the self and the other that embrace symbolizes and enacts. Basically, we need to reach out to others with double vision, putting ourselves in their shoes so that we can love them even in our differences. It's really hard to authentically love people who are different from us. And Wolf uses theology of Christianity to give us a template for how to do this. Wolf says, for the self shaped by the cross of Christ and the life of the triune God, embrace includes not just the other who is a friend, but also the other who is an enemy. Such a self will seek to open its arms towards the other, even when the other holds a sword. I disliked that Exclusion and Embrace was a challenging book to read. His theological and philosophical arguments were sometimes too complex for me to follow and difficult to absorb. But on the other hand, I did like the challenge of Wolf. I learned a new way to interpret another person's thoughts. I decided to tackle this book from the lens, what am I supposed to learn from this book? Instead of reading each page repeatedly, I highlighted one or two sentences from each page that resonated with me. Ultimately, the combination of Wolf's highlighted words taught me something. I learned that as a Christian, I have not been living as Jesus taught me in the way of loving our enemies. I am not doing my part to embrace others in a way that brings peace to the world. I have been taught love your enemies, but this book made me contemplate, do I really do this? I mentally listed all the people God has in my life that I could embrace better. I want to be the type of person who emulates Jesus' teaching. And Wolf has challenged me to do a better job of coming out of myself and into the arms of another, especially my adversaries.
Well, I had a lot of trouble with the book. I think that it was extremely informative on how to deal with social conflicts and clashing values. The biggest strength that Wolf had, in my opinion, was that he didn't speak on just one issue or one population as being part of the problem or solution. Rather, he was sure to be broad in his cultural explanation, and that's something that I can honor. The limitation of the book, as each one of you guys had mentioned, was that it was a difficult read. I found myself also rereading multiple portions of it, going back and trying to understand what he was trying to say, and it was not my favorite. But I will say that for the pieces that I did grasp, he is very intelligent, and he shows it in his writing and the way that he talks about embracing people and choosing not to exclude, which is, like Abby said, was something very difficult. And I think that most of the time we feel like we're doing it when really we're not. And it was a good eye opener to how we're living our life on a daily. We might have an enemy that, you know, has hurt us in the past, and it's something that we have put behind us. And that's something for me that this book brought into perspective and helped me wrestle with that, really. I wrestled with the book, but in a good way. So
Okay, well, we're going to move on and we're going to talk a little bit about Wolf. And the reason is because we need to understand the fullness and well-roundedness of Wolf's life, because it'll help us contextually understand his ideas in exclusion and embrace. How did he execute his arguments and come to his conclusions so dramatically? He was born September 25th, 1956 in Croatia. He has lived in Serbia, the United States, and Germany. He has studied philosophy, classical Greek, and theology, and he studied these topics all over the world at different universities. He's also attained a habilitation degree, which is a postdoctorate degree. Wolf has served as a faith-based advisor to the White House. He taught a course at Yale with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and is a media commentator on religious and cultural issues. His book, Exclusion and Embrace, was named by Christianity Today as one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century and won the 2002 Louisville Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Wolf also consults with the Vatican to promote Christian unity. Over the years, Wolf has been a preacher, a scholar, a theologian, and a professor. He has written over 10 books. Currently, he's employed as a professor of theology at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale University. Okay, I'm going to go over a summary of the introduction. In the introduction to Exclusion and Embrace, Miroslav Volf reflects on global crises, wars between cultural groups that inspired his book. He says the Bosnian War, the Los Angeles riots, the neo-Nazi marches in Berlin, and his return to Croatia after its independence led him to ponder his identity and conflict. Wolf says on page 16, it became clear to me that the problem of ethnic and cultural conflicts is part of a larger problem of identity and otherness. Wolf argues how our individual identities relate to others and how to embrace others in a way that will bring peace. He asks a question: how should we approach the ideas of identity and otherness and conflicts that rage around us, to foster the kind of social agents capable of envisioning and creating just, truthful, and peaceful societies, and on shaping a cultural climate in which agents will thrive? Wolf examines cultural conflict through 3 different lenses: universalist, communitarian, and postmodern. The Universalist lens advocates for shared values to promote coexistence. The communitarian lens emphasizes preserving different identities, and the postmodern lens prioritizes individual autonomy and fluid identity. Wolf discusses how Christianity can help with the struggle of our inward singleness and in becoming open and accepting of others. Christianity, particularly the Trinity and the cross, provides examples and instructions for embracing and loving others, even amidst our vast differences. The cross is an actual image of Christ dying for everyone, even the unjust sinner, his enemies. He redeems everyone by his death, which in turn brings joy. This example shows us how to embrace our enemy and go beyond ourselves for peace. Wolf uses embrace as a metaphor to discuss three central themes. One, mutuality of self-giving love in the Trinity, the doctrine of God. The outstretched arms of Christ on the cross for the godless, the doctrine of Christ. The open arms of the Father receiving the prodigal son, the doctrine on salvation. When I integrate counseling concepts into the introduction, I immediately think of key points I've learned in the counseling program at JBU. As Wolf writes about cultural conflict, I'm reminded of when working with a client who differs culturally from me, I need to research their culture and show curiosity and sensitivity by asking questions to make sure I understand. So I do not offend and I build good rapport. This will avoid cultural conflict. Wolf talks about viewing cultural conflict through different lenses, just as I, a counselor, will need to be aware that my client sees things different through a different lens than I do because of our life experiences, environment, socioeconomic status, and the list goes on. It's easy to think about applying spiritual religious values in counseling to what Wolf writes about, because being a Christian and applying those faith values is how Wolf says will bring peace to the world. Christians are supposed to show love and kindness to others and embrace them even if we're different. Just as Christ suffered and died for us to show us love, our clients will be suffering and we are to show them love by imitating Christ's love and acceptance. For example, if I had a client, a Muslim woman, 46 years old, who was seeking counseling for depression and anxiety. Because I wrote my world religion paper on Islam, I have a basic understanding of this woman's beliefs, but I would use the culturally responsive model to adapt interventions to this client's worldview and background. I would build rapport by listening well, asking questions, and leveraging their cultural strengths to set goals. I need to be aware of my own biases, show humility when working with the client, and recognize that the client sees things different from a different worldview. I always need to seek clarity to avoid rupture in the relationship.
Thank you. So I am going to review the chapter 1, distance and belonging, in a summary. Wolf opens the chapter by saying that throughout history, people of Christian faith are not immune from prejudice, nor able to resist the cultural identity insinuated as self-righteousness. Christians have become so commingled with the surrounding cultures that they lost their ability to see evils in those cultures. With the lens of boundaries become so blurry, the overriding commitment of culture weakens the church's ability to serve the one God and the ability to be the salt of the culture. Wolf asks, how should we live as cultural communities today faced with the new tribalism, and what should be the relations of the churches to the culture they inhabit? He proposes cultivating a healthy relation between the distance from culture and belonging as a solution. To help the readers understand what does distance and belonging mean, Wolf explores the relations between religious and cultural identity form. First, from the call of Abraham, and second, the Christian appropriation. So to answer God's call, one must depart from one's culture. In Genesis 12, 1-3, the Lord has called Abraham to depart his household to a land that the Lord had promised, and a promised heir did not have yet. This call to allegiance to God requires a departure on his part with great distance, great faith, and great courage. Abraham responded by uprooting his family from their cultural enmeshment to pursue God and his blessings. And yet, Abraham's departure from his original genealogy led him to the one God that was confined by the tribal worshiping, leaving access to God only among Abraham and his descendants. Thus, the Torah that was entrusted to him enabled to unify other human families as one family. So this creates a dilemma, and Wolf presents Apostle Paul's solution in this dilemma. Torah is no longer a membership of covenant. That's number one. But two, for the sake of equality, Paul discarded genealogy so that the promise can be received only by grace, not by race. Paul embraced Christ, the seed of the Abraham, and who was crucified and resurrected. In him, there's no longer Greek, Jew, slave, or free, male or female. And within that solution, all the human families are blessed on equal terms in Christ with our bodily inscribed differences. And given this ultimate allegiance to God and of all the cultures who offers his body as a home for all people, children of God must depart from their cultures. And now with Christ, they can depart the cultures, not having to live it. And instead, they may just do so by putting one foot stepped outside of their own culture, while the other family that firmly stands in it. Wolf further explains distance with belonging is isolation, and belonging without distance destroys. On one hand, the distance creates room for receiving others. That means that every church belongs to each other, and they are not a threat, but a potential source of enrichment. On the other hand, the distance demands a judgment against evil in every culture, and the distance created by the Spirit helps open eyes for self-deception, injustice, and destruction of evil. And this struggle against the falsehood, injustice, and the violence, both in self and other, is impossible with distance. So the concept, in terms of the counseling concepts and applications, I thought about the concept of religious and cultural identity can be borrowed to help counselors exploring with clients' identity formation and their association meaning. And that helps them get affirmed in their own identity. Having access to one God on equal terms may also be very useful in encouraging marginalized clients and immigrants and minorities and so on. So that's the part of the first chapter. Let's go to chapter 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
In chapter 2, Wolf defines exclusion in multiple ways. Exclusion often manifests itself in the self-perceived goodness as a deed of the good and the just that was imprisoned in the operator's good conscience. Exclusion is also a political, social, and a cultural system that insinuates itself between the self and the others. My conclusion, exclusion is a convoluted, struggling process in which the self identifies themselves against the others, by which they strengthen themselves by distinguishing themselves from the others. Wolf explores the exclusion from historical, psychological, and theological perspectives. Historically speaking, we have seen institutionalized exclusion in the forms of ethnical segregation in America, caste system in India, and apartheid in South Africa. Psychologically speaking, Wolf helps us to see why we exclude others in various forms. He states, We exclude because we don't like our accepted boundaries be blurred, our identities disturbed, our cultural orientation disarranged. We exclude also because we like or hate the way things are, but also because we desire the others have, and we want to secure our possessions while snatch power from others. In the extreme cases, we exclude by killing and driving out. So Wolf introduced the name of the doing good exclusion is usually orchestrated with certain themes such as victimization, exploitation, and economic crisis, power imbalance, and oppression, and so on, all giving us the illusion that the exclusion is necessary, righteous, and a call to our conscience, when in fact that is nothing but a wolf disguised under a sheep clothes, and it's brewing of corruption conceived under the manifest of well-being. In the same perceived goodness as a deed of the good and the just, perpetrators tirelessly generated their own innocence and do so by the double strategy of denying the wrongdoing and interpreting the normal significance of their actions, and lead systems and nations to mask violence and oppression that they perpetrate. And this cycle sucks people into our history and makes yesterday's victims today's perpetrators, and today's perpetrators tomorrow's victim, by which we all participate by ignoring the depths of their own partaking, when in fact there simply are no innocent. Yet the gospel tells us either the self nor the others need to be perceived as innocent in order to be loved, but ought to be embraced, even when they are perceived as wrongdoers. So there lays also a power of the exclusion. Wolf states, the evil in the exclusion has power over us. And yet, surprisingly, we choose evil, and evil also chooses and exerts great power over us. We allow wickedness of evil gets to us, and even entrap us because it kindles something evil in our own hearts. Moreover, evil is capable of not only creating illusion, but also shaping a reality with well-being baked in as a verity. So why we are still remaining in the captive system of exclusion? Wolf references Apostle Paul speaking in Romans 7:14 through 20, reminding us why we humans are incapable of doing the good as we want and not doing the evil we know we do not want, because there is a weaker self that wants to do good, but another stronger self that was dominated by sin wants to do evil. Therefore, we succumb to exclusion because we resonate with something was fabricated in the logic of exclusion. So the worst tragedy is we want what we want precisely when what we want is evil. And the evil is so invasive that it's easy to fall to its lure and allow its force to work into our will paradoxically, and we feel free in such a prisoned, unrecognized evil. So Wolf says, how are we supposed to escape such slavery of exclusion then? He points the light towards the spirit of the crucified Messiah, the self-giving Christ. The hope is in the spirit, entering in the self, and it frees its will so that it can resist the power of exclusion in the power of the spirit of embrace. So in terms of the counseling concept and application, what I see is the process of, in the process of the separating and binding, that God creates us with identity in the connection and differences and heterogeneity. This concept speaks to the nature of our coexistence with others and the world we're in. It helps us help sort those questions like, who am I? What defines me? And am I alone with myself in isolation? How can I connect with others? The relationship between the self and the center helps us answer the question as to what centers or grounds me. How are my identities solidified? These questions can help the counselors explore with the clients who struggles with the blurred identity. And by understanding both of these two first points I talked about, it will help us to help the clients set healthy boundaries by which they can build healthy and meaningful relationship without losing themselves. That's the end.
Well, I've got chapter 3 of Embrace. Just a quick skim over the chapter. He talks about the drama of embrace, the Trinity and embrace, and how that goes together, and that it is a costly embrace. A quote that I found on page 29 was, "The will to embrace precedes any truth about others and any construction of their justice." So the drama of embrace involves a 4-step process towards reconciliation. Step 1 being open arms, which symbolizes creating space for the other as an invitation. Step 2, waiting, which symbolizes the respect which we ought to have for the other person and their boundaries. And step 3, closing the arms, which symbolizes 2 pairs of arms closing the initial invitation as a full embrace. And step 4, opening the arms again, which symbolizes the distinct individuality of each person, even in the reconciliation. Christ embraced his enemies through the crucifixion and self-giving love. It is the ultimate embrace for humanity because he did so, modeling self-giving and unconditional love towards us who are undeserving. It is important to give ourselves before casting judgment on others, because judgment is to be left to God instead of taking revenge into our own hands. Now, the Trinity resembles the perfect communion between Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, where each are one God, yet hold differences in their role as God. The parallel is that we are all human, yet hold differences in our role as humans. And the Trinity teaches us to celebrate and embrace those differences rather than exclude people for them. Embracing is costly, as I mentioned, and it is a risk to approach someone, an enemy in particular, with open arms when they may have intentions to harm. Humility and openness are required to fully embrace more than actually understanding the concept of embrace. Wolf talks about how we must be willing to forgive in order to embrace. Forgiveness, according to Wolf, is not about dismissing the harm that was caused. Rather, it is about the grace to love our enemies. And then as for the counseling application, recalling the hurt would look like aligning with Wolf's understanding and of justice and truth. And sorry, before I continue in this piece, this will be how Wolf's text can be applied to modalities like the reach model or narrative therapy. So recalling the hurt would look like aligning with Wolf's understanding of justice and truth. We cannot offer a cheap embrace which ignores the past, because it is the reframing of how we recall the past that begins the process of embracing. Empathizing looks like Wolf's understanding of making space for the other, and double vision, which will be further explained in future slides. Altruism in deciding to offer forgiveness by grace when we feel forgiveness is not deserved. Committing to forgiveness would be like the action of reopening your arms in the drama of embrace. And holding on to forgiveness is like being willing to open our arms more than once with certain people, as sometimes that is the case. And the drama of embrace can be used in counseling for processing forgiveness and making goals with the client. It can be used both literally and figuratively. A literal embrace could be helpful in couples counseling or family therapy once some reparation work has already been done. And for individual therapy, explaining, as Wolf explained, the process of reconciliation through embracing can help the client reframe the way they think or feel about their hurt and the person who hurt them. During this process, the counselor would help the client learn to be vulnerable once again in a healthy way, because a true embrace can only happen if the client is ready to be vulnerable since they are unable to control the reactions of the opposite person. So that is my chapter 3 summary. And as for chapter 4, is the relational model of the Trinity. So relational model of the Trinity, God models the common humanity and embracing in gender dynamic and how that plays out. So the Trinity is like I said, a relational model for how male and female should interact based on love. Second, God models our common humanity rather than being a model only for men, specifically fathers, which is something that Wolf touched on in the book. This was a direct challenge to views from theologians like Karl Barth, who claim that men uniquely model the divine identity described in Scripture. And third is the idea of embracing a neutral gender dynamic. The Trinitarian model for humanity calls for an egalitarian relationship, I think I said that correctly, between man and women, instead of a hierarchy, this meaning equality amongst each other. Wolf explains his interpretation of particular verses about a male hierarchy as subordinate to verses about gender equality. Wolf urges readers to carefully engage with culture and avoid conforming to gender norms. He said in the book, what is normative is not some essence of femininity and masculinity, but the procedures modeled on the life of the triune God, through which women and men in specific cultural settings should negotiate their mutual relations and constructions of femininity and masculinity, which I believe was on page 182. He argues that this stance encourages a Christian identity that is open and welcoming, ready to embrace each other as equals despite the differences. Now, another quote that I gathered from page 172 was, whether we use masculine or feminine metaphors for God, God models our common humanity and not our gender specificity. And as for the counseling application, Wolf's perspective on gender norms can be helpful with marriage counseling, encouraging mutual respect. Counselors and clients alike can be encouraged by this. My first thought was how this may apply to marriage counselings and how it would be helpful for couples who struggle to see eye to eye on their roles as a spouse. The idea that both men and women are equal can encourage the couple towards a compromise where neither experience diminishing of self-worth. Counselors can also benefit from this perspective because developing a porous identity, as Wolf mentioned, leaves less and less room for discomfort with aspects of clients' gender or perspectives on gender that is different than theirs. This also encourages empathy and compassion for clients who are struggling with their identity, and being porous can greatly contribute to a strong therapeutic relationship as well. Lastly, it is important to realize that culture has a great impact on clients and can be part of their struggle with self-worth. Wolf's urge to engage with culture carefully can encourage clients to move away from harmful gender norms and towards finding their self-worth as a human being.
Wonderful. So then moving on to chapter 5, which is pertaining to oppression and justice. For a quick summary, because I could never hit all of the points that Wolf did. Wolf highlights that seeking justice requires the will and the want to embrace others, calling back to chapter 3. And in relation to that, he talks about different oppression and wars and different acts of violence throughout history. And he uses this as discussing how it underlies our society. Our society is underlined by oppression, injustice, and violence. And so justice is a key aspect of our society, but we cannot understand or go about actually achieving justice without utilizing double vision, which is looking at yourself and the other with openness and humility, and having an open mind and the will to embrace that other. And so he also mentions different aspects of Christian religion and how that can demonstrate forgiveness and embrace in relation to justice. So this includes the sacrificial love of Jesus Christ and the idea that this is an important concept to understand, of course, but we cannot utilize God's perspective on justice because it is essentially flawed in our eyes. We can view God's justice in a certain light, but because we are both part of God's world and part of our world, we put our own thoughts and ideas and opinions into what we view as God's perspective on justice. Because of that, we can use that as an example and how to go about performing justice in the real world. But he believes justice cannot happen with the embrace, and ultimately justice is only possible through injustice being forgiven and finally forgotten, which of course is easier said than done. Additionally, justice can only be done when they find themselves reconciled within the embrace of the triune God, as Wolf said on page 224. And so these are a lot of big concepts to wrestle with, of course, but ultimately what it boils down to is we must practice embracing the other. We must practice the concept of double vision. And this is key aspects of the counseling concepts. Let me move this over so you can see. And so the term double vision, it leads the counselors to want to practice cultural sensitivity and empathy because we are utilizing the term double vision, which is looking at the other and oneself with openness and humility. This is similar to Carl Rogers' perspective taking and fosters an honest and understanding therapeutic relationship within counseling sessions. This also means that whenever we are trying to undergo the topic of cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity, while we are trying to do that, why we are trying to foster that skill, we are ultimately attempting or successfully utilizing double vision. And so in addition to this, justice and healing go hand in hand. This perspective, at least spiritually, it encourages counselors to embody that compassion and that grace, modeling the sacrificial love that was reflected in Christ's example. Different interventions that promote forgiveness specifically are important when utilizing the concepts that Wolf described in the counseling room. Additionally, Wolf's theology reminds counselors that justice and healing are intertwined and are necessary in order to foster that understanding and that empathy and relational growth in the counseling room and within spiritual maturity and the ethics of counseling. Additionally, the concept of unconditional positive regard and empathy that can be seen through the forgiveness that Wolf discussed, because without unconditional positive regard, even for one's enemy, what was once perceived as an enemy, how do you go about that forgiveness? These principles, of course, translate to accurate empathy within the counseling room, which is another Carl Rogers term. And counselors who adopt this stance, they typically promote genuine connection in the counseling room, and there's genuine connection in healing. Additionally, an example for a case study or a case example is because Wolf talks so much about oppression within this chapter and different acts of wars and violence. Imagine you receive a client that has been part of a war, has either been in a war or victim of that war, whether it was in the military or as just a typical civilian. And so they've got war-related trauma. They struggle with oppression and they struggle with those ideas that Wolf conceptualized in this chapter. And so how do we go about treating this client? Utilizing Wolf's ideas within this chapter, we can look at that client's pain and their desire for justice because of the hurt and trauma they've endured at the hands of those oppressors. But we can also introduce the possibility of healing through forgiveness. Justice is not always eye for an eye, but instead it's being the bigger man and laying down arms and attempting to forgive them instead. And so introducing that healing through forgiveness and also reflecting trauma-informed counseling, where forgiveness is empowering the survivor rather than excusing the perpetrator. We're not forgiving what they did to that client, but instead we're telling that client that injustice, true justice, is only possible through that forgiveness. And so, like it says at the top, justice is possible only through injustice being forgiven and finally forgotten. Moving on to chapter 6.
Wolf writes about truth, memory, and perspective in building a peaceful community where everyone can be included and embraced. Each person will remember each event differently. Even if they try their hardest to report the truth, they are jaded by their own life experience and how they saw the event. Personal events can be horrific, but for someone not to seek revenge, they must try to remember the event with love and not hate. An example of this is that as Christians, we remember Christ's Last Supper and crucifixion. We remember that these events were beyond comprehension, but we recognize them with love. Christ died for us willingly out of love for our sins. Christian faith is fundamentally built upon remembering a terrible event with love. Personal and cultural perspectives shape our memories and understanding of history. Facts are interpreted through larger narratives, which we can argue for truth. Because of our backgrounds and interests, we have limited knowledge and a narrow lens for seeing events. Only God sees the truth. We need to be aware of our humanity when we repeat a memory, our truth. Wolf says that in our need for self-preservation and power, we must consciously remember this weakness when trying to be fair about a memory. Using double vision, putting ourselves in another's shoes and trying to see it from their perspective can help us get close to the truth, which is seeing how God sees. To find truth, we must be willing to change, let go of our self-serving beliefs, and live truthfully. Truth is not just saying something, it's doing something. For true peace in a community, people must tell the truth and trust one another. Deceit destroys relationships. Wolf links commitment to truth, saying it must go hand in hand with nonviolence. Absolute freedom comes from being committed to both truth and nonviolence. This allows us to understand others and move beyond our own interests and build authentic relationships based on truth rather than deception or violence. Wolf says, everywhere is how God sees human beings, from outside and within. We can try to see others as God sees us. This will help us know truth. This is Wolf's view of how we should see our clients' truth. We can see our clients as God would see them. Only being Christ-like and looking at our clients with God's love can we see their truths without being jaded by our own memories, perspectives, and truths. A client's perspective and truth will shape each client's memory. I need to be cognizant that I, as the counselor, could have a similar experience, but it will be a very different memory for me than for my client. I have learned in class that I never need to assume I know what a client is feeling or thinking just because I have had a similar experience. If I'm having trouble relating to a client, I can ask more questions and show genuine curiosity. I would use reflection to ensure that I am clear on what has been said and on the client's experiences, and the client feels heard. Understanding my client's truth will help me help him. A 50-year-old man presents to my room for counseling. He is feeling depressed and having panic attacks, and he is starting to isolate and disconnect from relationships and feel worthless and fearful that he can't do his job. After reviewing his adverse childhood experiences questionnaire assessment, I realize he suffers from significant trauma. I need to build rapport so that the client can be vulnerable in disclosing his traumatic experiences, and he needs to be truthful to release his suffering. I can use double vision to better understand my client by putting myself in his shoes. I would use EMDR along with narrative therapy. Using these two interventions, I would help the client reprocess his negative thoughts and rewrite his life story. He would process traumatic memories and learn new coping skills. He would build personal strengths and learn to separate from his trauma. It would no longer shape his identity and control his life. In the end, the client needs to trust me so he can be truthful. And I need to see the client as Jesus would see him, with love and with his strengths and blessing as the key to his peace.
Wonderful. And so the very last chapter concerns violence and peace. And so whenever I was reading this chapter, not only did I find it extremely interesting, but I really enjoyed how Wolf decided to discuss it. So within this chapter, he discusses the concepts of violence and peace and how these two concepts impact the world as a whole. What I really liked about this was he discussed how Christ can help break the cycles of violence by the cross itself and what this cross demonstrates. And so the cross, as it shows here on the slide, it has 4 different applications to how it can break the cycle of violence. And so it exhibits, first of all, what divine embrace even looks like, even for the unjust, the untruthful, the violent. And so this is something that if there's peace among religions, then this could only prevent strictly religious wars. So that's one step that it can take. But we can utilize how the cross breaks the cycle of violence and integrate it into our own personal lives, is basically what Wolf is trying to discuss in this chapter. Additionally, most actions to enact peace ultimately result in more violence. And so Wolf argues that the cross itself breaks this cycle when Jesus exercised the principle of non-resistance, and that the cross, quote, lays bare the mechanism of scapegoating. By this, identifying a victim as a scapegoat, Wolf says, it leads to a revelation that makes the significance of the lies and the deceit and the violence that unfolds as part of a larger strategy. It makes the object of scapegoating no longer operate if we can identify who that victim is in the present moment instead of after the fact. Additionally, the cross signifies Jesus's struggle for God's truth and justice, because this was not Jesus's only act of significance, but the significance of this lies in non-violence being part of that. And lastly, the cross is a divine embrace of the deceitful and unjust. This leads to a world of embrace, because if one can embrace the deceitful and the unjust and forgive them, like we mentioned in chapter 5, it is because of God's own embrace and atonement. Wolf said only those who are willing to embrace the deceitful and the unjust, as Christ had done on the cross, will be able to employ reason and discourse as instruments of peace instead of violence, instead of perpetrating that violence by utilizing these things to form wars, to perform religious wars specifically. We can instead use that to utilize the concept of the will to embrace in order to, lead to that peace and give that principle of non-resistance power in the modern world. And so instead of being transferred and displaced, embrace is the only way to go about violence, because any other action to try to eliminate violence, it will only transfer it somewhere else in some other way, shape, or form. And so then move this over once again, so you guys can see. How does this chapter integrate counseling concepts? And so the cross is a model of unconditional positive regard and compassion. And so this is important for counselors to utilize in the counseling room, of course, not only to create that therapeutic relationship that is the foundation of effective counseling, but it is important to be able to show that for your clients and model that for your clients so that they have a basis to go off of in their future endeavors and in their relationships in their life. So Wolf's emphasis on the cross as the model of divine embrace, even towards the deceitful and unjust, it caused counselors to embody these same characteristics, such as compassion and empathy. But in addition to that, it leads to grace and restorative engagement within that counseling room. And once again, it also leads to those forgiveness-based interventions, like I mentioned in chapter 5. This guides the client towards reconciliation and inner peace, because the forgiveness for that injustice can be honed into a counselor's practice by discussing empathy. It enables clients or counselors to be non-judgmental. And so the violence, so much similar to chapter 5, the violence that many clients face, whether it be because of oppression or just different forms of violence, then these forgiveness-based interventions and the willingness to embrace and the willingness to forgive and learning how to forgive are key aspects that need to be exemplified in the counseling room through empathy, unconditional positive regard, and compassion. Additionally, Volf's belief that peace requires forgiveness and embrace highlights the counselor's role as a non-judgmental presence who just models this acceptance and compassion. And this professional identity rooted in humility is what promotes inner peace and acceptance, not only for the counselor, but to model that for the clients as well, for them to eventually achieve inner peace. And lastly, the idea that Volf introduced regarding the cross lays bare the mechanism of scapegoating. This can be used in counseling with clients who may internalize their emotions, could be internalizing emotions of the shame and guilt and disappointment they feel in their everyday lives. Counselors can help the clients by making them realize healing doesn't come from self-punishment. It doesn't come from internalizing your emotions. It doesn't come from replaying those different situations or feelings in your head. It comes from acceptance of divine love and forgiveness instead. And so that is chapter 7. Our last thing will be some final comments given by Abby. Here, I'll move you up, Abby.
Okay. So as I read this book, I was feeling frustrated, and frankly, I wasn't feeling very smart because I would have to read things over and over again. And as I mentioned in my summary, I started just highlighting the things that really resonated with me on the pages just to help me maybe get to what Wolf was trying to teach in each chapter. And then also after reading the chapter on gender identity, I had a question in my mind too. So I thought to myself, I'm just going to see where he works and email him. And I Googled him and I found him and I found his email and I sent him an email and I asked him, am I reading this book correctly? I think I just wanted some validation that he was okay with how I was interpreting his story. And anyways, I got a response. We were super excited as a group that he responded. And he said that I was tackling the book well. And then I also had a question, about the gender and identity chapter, because in today's climate of gender confusion, and it just seems to consume media, conversations, I just wondered if he would have written this chapter any differently. And he responded that in the second edition, he left it out, that he did not have the time to rewrite the chapter. So, he didn't say how or why or what the new how he would rewrite it. So I'm still very curious, but I was right in my thinking that he would have written it differently. So we were super excited as a group to get a response from Wolf. So thank you.
And then last but not least, here's our references, which includes Exclusion and Embrace, if you wanted to read it yourselves. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank y'all.
Thank you.